everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Human School's Curation Corner, one part of our learning here at the Human School. I'm Randy.
I'm Rachel.
And I'm Chad.
All right. Good to see you guys again. Each episode, we engage in brief conversations focused on a specific resource. First, we'll summarize the author's ideas. Then we'll make connections to our own experiences. And finally, we'll share some insights and some additional questions that you can further your own learning with. In this episode, we're chatting about the article, How Parents Can Help Kids Redefine What It Means to Be Smart by Olka Joshi Hansen. If you're interested in the article, you can find a link below this video at thehuman.school. All right, so to kick it off, what's the author saying? We've just been through a pandemic, and what she's suggesting, focusing on her audience of parents, is that the pandemic has really provided parents with a window into the education system, a window that they're probably seeing some things that they hadn't seen before, and also a window into their own children. And she suggests that there are three ways that parents can help their children learn and thrive in a system that tends to measure success a little bit differently than the way she looks at it. So what are those three things? First, it's not whether they're smart, it's how they're smart. Second, what did your children learn during the pandemic as a result of being at home, in communities, and paying attention to different things? And the third thing, parents can help their children's formal education work better by having conversations about what works best for how their children learn and what doesn't work. All right, so what connections am I making? So I think at the heart of this article, I'm seeing a bunch of mind shifts, a bunch of reframes, things like how we reframe smart, how we reframe this idea of learning loss, how we reframe a pandemic as an opportunity to actually learn more about the education system and our children. So I'm curious what your connections were.
So I immediately was thinking about a tour that we did at work a couple of weeks ago. So our district has a technical high school that's attached to it that a couple of different districts go into. And I was thinking about when I went there, I had never been in a technical school. We had some of those skill sets in my high school, but it was never its own space and never to this development. It was incredible to see the amount of specificity and real world for kids and how it really focused and passionate and excited and happy they were. Especially because oftentimes the stereotype for our technical school students is they don't like school. And first of all, clearly not true, but it's what it is that they're being asked to do, and that connection. So I really loved her framing of not are they smart, but how are they smart? Because I think that assumption oftentimes is when you don't fit into the box of academic smart and certain academics. And in certain ways, I loved her point about being able to be quiet and sitting still and how antithetical that is to learning. And that this space that we visited, I couldn't stop thinking about it as I was reading this article, that it is in some ways a living embodiment of what she was talking about, but that some kids have found even before the pandemic. So yeah, I couldn't stop thinking about that.
For me, I've been really frustrated with the whole narrative around learning loss. And I think the narrative around learning loss has kind of been its own tragedy. I think this idea that learning stops because we're not in school, it's dumb, which is not great language, but it is. And as Olka Joshi Hansen mentions, our kids, they may not have been learning the things in school that, a bunch of white guys 150 years ago decided was important. But they absolutely learned. This idea that our kids learned nothing during the pandemic it just goes to show how short-sighted our definition of learning has become to only embody this school skills, which, let's be honest, very few actually gets translated into the world around them, the way that school is currently structured now. And I'd also connect to the idea that our kids learned a lot about human behavior, and it's specifically about, cruddy adult behavior during the pandemic. So this idea that our kids, they lived in this vacuum over the past 2 years, and they lost. They lost in ways that I don't think people are talking about, which is they watched the adults around them act in some pretty horrific ways. And so, I don't know, that's like one of the big connections for me around this. And as I watch my own boys, I hope the way that she describes some of the schools in the article, that they get an opportunity to learn. My son's teacher uses clip charts, as a behavior management tool. And it's something that I fundamentally disagree with, because behavior is not a thing to be managed. And it's a deficit model as opposed to an appreciative or a strengths-based model. And I think that's also what Joshi Hanson's talking about when she talks about how kids, when they're learning to read, if some kids want to read with their fingers, and some kids want to listen, and some kids, want to read with a partner, that we define reading through this one finite lens that everyone has to do it one way and the right way. And that's just not the way the world outside of school operates. So a lot of strong feelings I had coming from her writing and my frustration with what schooling does to kids.
Yeah, a couple good connections there. I wonder, Chad, and maybe if anyone's listening, they can direct us to some research. If anybody's done any research on what kids' opinions are about what they learned or didn't learn during the pandemic and when they were in remote instruction. I'd be curious if there's anything out there.
Me too. And I will tell you,
from the student perspective,
I think that we're surveying a lot of kids. And again, this is not inherently bad, but a lot of schools are surveying kids on their social emotional welfare. And in a lot of ways, they're loaded questions. I'm not denying that there are social emotional wellness needs. I'm not denying that everyone's mental health has suffered. That is not my point. But I wonder if we can also object not just to the fact that there may not have been a lot of people asking learners about what they learned, but the questions that we're asking kids about what they learned or what they experienced are very much loaded to drive our narrative. So that would be like one caution point there, but I think your point is well taken.
And what kinds of questions would kids ask? And the connection I'm making to Rachel's comment is, as superintendent, we were able to send our kids to Lehigh Career Technical Institute, which is probably, arguably, one of the best career tech schools, at least in the state, if not nationally recognized as well. Amazing place, probably somewhere between 20 and 30 labs that kids can choose from. And as superintendent, we would do 2 visits a year, one in the beginning of the year and one sometime in the spring. And we would sometimes take school board members, and we would sometimes take the school administrators, and the folks at LCTI would set up a schedule for us where we would see probably 6 to 8 students. And it was always amazing and heartwarming to see how students who sometimes didn't succeed in the regular school environment were like articulate, passionate, skilled, and just had found the place that made their heart sing. It was just, I always left there every single time feeling like, wow, what an opportunity our kids had. And we would probably send 20% of our high school there. So, and it's probably 11 school districts that feed into it. So it's a pretty amazing place, and a really good example of how people have different kinds of smarts. So one of my insights as we wrap this up on this article is around being objectors. It seems like a lot of our focus here is being objectors. That's an easy way to start, obviously. But it's around this idea of enrolling parents in being objectors too. And I think really her article, if there was a way to summarize it, would be parents, you could be objectors, and here are some ways that you can start being objectors around the context that we've all been through and hopefully are on the tail end of, and that is the pandemic. How about your insights?
So I couldn't help but focus too on her point about the soft skills and how so many of those are unifying across multiple areas. And I kept thinking about what happens if we let all of the content areas go. Sorry, wrong S. And just focused on the soft skills, let students self-select. And I'm thinking about, is there content knowledge that is a necessity that kids have to know? And then if so, who decides? And how much can we let go? And this is like a really controversial opinion coming from an English teacher, right? That like we all really love like Shakespeare and the classics and the canon, and I do. But I recognize that the idea that all kids have to know those things is really a small, sort of like narrow opinion, and it's really country specific. I remember meeting a guy in college who was from Israel, and I said something about Shakespeare, and he was like, "Yeah, I don't know who that is." And I was like, "What?" But it was a great moment for me to remember how much these things that we think everybody has to know is really context specific, and then do they really have to know it if we're becoming globalized, if we're becoming really truly interconnected? And then if we can let things go, who decides what we let go?
So Rachel, I'm thinking about, I'm working my way through a book called Walk Out, Walk On by, I think it's Margaret Wheatley. And the book is not really focused on the West at all. It's very Eastern. So, that's not true. They take us to Mexico and they take us to India and they take us to, Africa. But one of the big connections I have there is that point about how we assume the context because we live in the context and don't recognize that there's just such a broader world out there. And so I just wanted to simply share with you that I think you're right about that. I have a little bit of a response just in terms of, how do we decide what stays and what goes, in the sense that I'm a big believer in just-in-time learning instead of just-in-case learning. I'd say 98% of the traditional curriculum in schools is just-in-case learning. Someday you might need this, so we're going to learn it just in case, instead of allowing people the space to, figure it out just in time. And I think that's because our system is so focused on efficiency. She talks in the article about, how in other countries, they don't even begin formal reading instruction until the kids are 6 or 7 years old, because developmentally, they're not necessarily ready to read until, 6, 7, and maybe even as late as 8. And even then, if you don't learn to read in the traditional way, that doesn't mean that, your brain no longer can, access information. And I think she defines literacy through what I perceive as a more modern lens, which is literacy is about gathering information and making decisions about it and recreating and sharing that back out with the world. And we've made literacy only about reading and only about writing. And let's face it, that is not the predominant way in which people communicate today. And yet we have very many people kind of stuck in that paradigm. So, I think my insight is really just around how we allow our kids the opportunity to learn in the ways that make sense for them. And, much like your question, Randy, and I know we'll get to our questions in a second, my question is about how we enroll our parents and our system in a way that allows everyone to have a unified purpose, which is probably too idealistic. But right now, there are as many definitions of what the purpose of school is as there are stars in the sky.
I have one extra question for Chad. So as a former American history teacher, what if they leave school and they know next to nothing about it? How does that feel for you?
Well, I think that it's the idea that there are guardrails and there's a guide on the side mentality. Like there's certain things that I would say you would hope that kids would come in contact with intentionally through design. I don't think that this idea that, kids walk in every day and they just simply do whatever they want at all times. That's not my vision for what schooling is. I think that the adults still have a critical, important role to play in this. But let's just say it like it is, though. We've got curriculum that says every kid's got to learn this, 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 and this. And I can tell you, I spent 8 weeks teaching, the Bill of Rights, and I always joked I could do it on top of a table, in my underwear and hope that kids remember it. And some kids still could not leave a unit remembering the 3 branches of government. And this is what happens with discrete content and skills. And maybe that's a condemnation of my teaching practices. I don't know. But what I would say is this idea that there is discrete knowledge that every kid needs to have. That's fine. That's easy, because that's about, if I say it and they don't get it, I've done my job. But that's not learning. And I think that we've built an entire system built on teaching and not on learning.
Mm. All right. Good segue into questions for this week in this edition of Curation Corner. How might we include parents in this movement to transform schooling? What elements of learning are essential? Is any content essential? If so, who decides? And how might we help schools and parents become aligned around learning and a purpose for schooling? Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks for learning alongside us here at the Human Schools Curation Corner. Visit thehuman.school and its Learning in Public Hub for any additional resources. And please join the conversation in our Facebook community committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Bye for now.
Bye, guys.